What's up, you guys? It's Graham here. So I've been getting a lot of people sending me this chart showing that tenants are quickly falling behind on their rent, and therefore it's an early warning sign that we're Okay, in all seriousness, I felt like this is something worth addressing so that I could share my own thoughts about what's going on, because from my perspective, this is a little bit concerning. After all, I've worked full-time in real estate since 2008. I currently own multiple rental properties. And even though I currently spend most of my time just begging for likes on YouTube, real estate is how I built my entire career. So yeah, this chart hits close to home. That's why we gotta discuss exactly what's happening, why so many tenants are falling behind on their rent, my response to the entire situation, and then what this means for you watching. Because I have to say, there's a lot going on beneath the surface that most people are completely unaware of. Although before we start, if you appreciate breaking down just the facts, it would mean the world to me if you hit the like button or subscribe if you haven't done that already. It's totally free, it takes you a split second, and as promised, here's a picture of a cute squirrel. So thanks so much, and also big thank you to Cook Unity for sponsoring this video, but more on that later. Alright, so let's talk about this chart. Late rental payments continue to tick up. Now, this alone is likely enough to cause a lot of people to panic because 1, tenants are undoubtedly worried about falling behind, 2, landlords are worried about not receiving their rent, and 3, investors are worried about the repercussions that this could have throughout the entire market if the economy begins falling apart. Not to mention, for the average person right now, things aren't exactly looking so great. Like, this comes at a time when 1 in 3 Americans has no emergency savings and the median savings is just $500. So it's a given that with job losses accelerating, rent is probably going to be something that falls to the sidelines, at least temporarily. However, as someone who actively watches the entire real estate market, both nationally and for my own properties, I have to say, when I saw this chart being shown on its own with no other context other than late rental payments go up, I started to get a bit skeptical that there's more to this than meets the eye. After all, if you want to analyze this data properly and get a true representation of how many tenants are not actually paying their rent, it is crucial that you take a step back and look at these numbers in the big picture, because believe it or not, it is normal for almost 20% of tenants not to pay their rent on time in full. Yes, that is a true statistic. In a good market, nearly 1 out of 5 tenants is not paying their rent on time in full. Let that sink in. Anyway, in terms of understanding what this means and how many tenants are really not paying their rent, it is important that we talk about this next one, and that would be partial payments. See, here's the thing. When you actually go and read the source article, you'll see that for rent to be considered paid, it has to be paid in full by the time it's due. And I gotta say, as a landlord of over 15 years, it is quite frequent that something just comes up. Not all rent gets paid on time. Sometimes a partial payment is made. And in those cases, if there's any delay whatsoever, or it's not paid in full, it's not counted here as paid on time. Second, this also doesn't count partial upfront payments, where the tenant's able just to pay what they can, even if it's enough to cover the first few weeks, and then they catch up by the end of the month. Which brings me to third, tenants not paying their rent on time in full is surprisingly common. Like, they don't tell you that at the pandemic low, just 80% of tenants paid their rent on time compared to 2023 when that number was as high as 88%. In fact, before the pandemic in 2019, that number still hovered around the same 83% mark, meaning at any given point in time, 12 to 20% of tenants were not paying their rent in full by the time it's due. Although fourth, the good news is that by the end of the month, more than 90% of tenants do eventually catch up, and this has been fairly consistent over time, basically implying that the majority of tenants are able to pay their rent, eventually, but with growing delays. And yeah, it does seem to be getting a little worse according to this chart. So are late payments becoming a lot more frequent, and is this something to be worried about? Well, first of all, yes, even though most tenants do eventually get caught up by the end of the month, more renters are falling behind today than back in 2020. Like, it is true that ever since May of 2025, the number of tenants falling behind has increased from 8.4% to 11.7%, suggesting that they're becoming more reliant on middle-of-the-month income to be able to get fully caught up. In fact, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau just published their data on late fees, and they found that the fraction of late fees has increased from 15.4% at the end of 2021 to 23% by the beginning of 2023, but then declined to 14% by November of 2024. On top of that, they also noted that around half of renters who incurred a late fee returned to having their rent paid on time, which implies that a lot of these are simply a one-off event. However, here's where things get very interesting. according to the same study, even though renters were incurring fewer late fees today than back a few years ago, the tenants who are behind owed a lot more in back rent. Or basically, the people who are struggling the most every month are usually in the biggest financial trouble. Although in terms of what this means for the economy, there is one small piece of fine print which completely changes this data, and you're going to want to hear this. Although before we go to that, I know we usually talk money here in the channel, but here's another recent data point that you should probably be made aware of. The average American household now spends more than $500 a month on groceries, and even crazier is that a third of that goes to waste. That is exactly why it's so important to get back into a routine. Like with summer coming to an end, people are going to get busy with work, eat less healthy, and start sacrificing quality for the sake of saving time. That's why I've been literally using our sponsor, Cook Unity, all the time. For those unaware, Cook Unity delivers restaurant-quality, pre-packaged meals delivered straight to your door for an amazing price. I've been able to eat and try foods like this incredible grilled Asian hanger steak made by Chef Stacy Barang and this Peruvian flat iron steak made by Chef Nelson Brizuela. All of this tastes like I'm eating food cooked from a high-end restaurant for a fraction of the price. Like when I broke down the cost of eating each meal, it was cheaper than what I was spending at Chipotle for way higher quality. And I'm not even exaggerating. I have no idea how they stay in business, but I'm not questioning it because I really enjoy their food. Plus, there's no grocery shopping, no meal prep, no cleanup, no dishes. Just heat it up and it's ready in minutes. Not to mention, their flexibility is amazing. You could choose between 4 to 16 meals a week, pause or cancel at any time, and you could personalize everything. I typically go and order the high-protein meals under 600 calories, but there's truly something for everyone, no matter what you like. So if you want to save time, save money, cut food waste, and get back into a routine by eating healthy, I would highly recommend Cook Unity. Just visit cookunity.com/Graham and use the code GRAHAM50 at checkout to get 50% off of your first order. Again, I have no idea how they actually make money on that type of discount, but I'm not questioning it. So the link is down below. Thank you so much, and now let's get back to the video. All right, now in terms of whether or not this chart means the end of the world as we know it, take a look at this perspective, which I found very interesting, and that would be mom and pop landlords. When it comes to this, here's the reality. Not all landlords are created equally, and as it turns out, mom and pop landlords who own less than 10 units have the lowest overall collection rates. Part of this could be due to the fact that mom and pop landlords are often less experienced and therefore less likely to enforce on-time payments. But the other point is that mom and pop landlords are more likely to buy smaller units, which attract tenants with lower incomes who are more likely to be late in the first place. This also very much changes state by state. For example, California has some of the highest on-time payment history, while Georgia has the lowest, and places like Washington, D.C. were more reliable than those in Chicago or New York. Personally though, even though it's already widely studied and known that renters living in units owned by mom and pop landlords are less likely to pay rent on time, I'll tell you from first-hand experience, most mom and pop landlords are a lot more accommodating and compassionate than corporate landlords who do everything through lawyers and third-party management agencies, and as a result of that, they are likely to have a lot more flexibility when it comes to paying late or making partial payments. On top of that, most mom and pop landlords are also less experienced vetting tenants, so they often won't have the strict income and credit score requirements that a management company might have. Sometimes this winds up being a net positive for everyone involved because the tenant gets to move in a place that they otherwise would have been denied on, and the landlord gets to rent out their place to a tenant who's going to take care of it. But other times, the landlord might be too easygoing and the tenant begins paying later and later and later just because they could get away with it. Ask me how I know. I posted a video on this years ago for anyone who wants to check it out. I'll link to it down below in the description. Anyway, in terms of paying late rent, it's also no surprise that mom and pop landlords are often disproportionately affected by receiving late rent because a lot of them don't have the reserves to make their mortgage and property tax payments that a large corporation does. So as a result, when they don't get their rent, you bet they're going to do everything possible just to be able to collect something, then nothing, and that results in partial payments being made. Although even though we've identified which properties have the most late rent and where late rents are the most common, there is one more topic that's worth talking about, and that would be, are renters falling behind? Well, in terms of this chart, here's the fine print, which admittedly seems to skew the results. 1. Units that have not paid any form of rental income in the previous 60 days are removed from the tracking sample. That means that this chart only shows tenants who end up paying, but who don't pay on time. So it understates how many tenants are in financial distress and who haven't paid in more than 2 months, and underestimates the amount of tenants who are really behind on their payments. 2. Rent charges below $500 and above $10,000 are excluded from this analysis. Obviously, this was meant to eliminate low-income, subsidized housing, or luxury development from skewing the results, but it is something worth considering. Along with 3, late payments are tracked on a 3-month moving average. Now, this is meant to stabilize how they collect their data, which is based on rents collected on the 15th of each month. Doing that prevents short-term volatility spikes, but it also smooths out the data from inconsistent unknown variables, so we miss out on one month that could be worse than others. In the big picture, though, my overall assessment is that yes, it does seem pretty accurate. They've collected data from more than 66,000 renters, and I think it paints a fairly realistic picture. But unfortunately, since a lot of rent payments are private transactions that don't get publicly reported, there's nothing out there that exists which gives us a greater understanding of how many tenants are really behind on their rent and how much they actually owe. Like, I would love for there to be a mass credit reporting agency out there that shows us that 8% of tenants are behind on their rent, and between this bracket and this bracket, they owe an average of this amount. And here's how many tenants are actually getting evicted overall based on property type, like you kind of have with a credit card. But instead, we have to rely on independent collection agencies, and this might be kind of limited. Anyway, here's what I think. In 2025, it is clear that late rental payments have risen in the past year above historical averages, but a 1 or 2 percentage point increase isn't really that much to be concerned about. Yet. Like, here's the thing. Americans now have slightly less disposable income than they did a few years ago. Rents and property costs are continuing to rise, and nearly half of all renters are cost burdened, meaning they spend more than a third of their income on housing, leaving very little room for anything else. At the same time, auto delinquencies among subprime borrowers are rising, and more of each paycheck is being diverted to areas outside of housing. This is evidenced by the fact that credit scores have now seen their biggest one-year drop since the Great Recession, which again indicates that people are accumulating more and more debt. To me, this entire chart seems like the natural result of higher housing costs, rising consumer debt, higher interest rates, and less pandemic support, which is giving way to slightly higher missed payments. But then again, it's not at a level that's worth worrying about. So here's my advice. For landlords, usually it's best to work out an agreement with your tenant because evictions are time-consuming, expensive, and should be avoided unless absolutely necessary. From my experience, the majority of tenants are honest, hardworking people, and it's really unfortunate that a few bad apples get the vast majority of coverage when they try to take advantage of the generosity of unknowing landlords. Just know that's not always the case, and it's usually best to try to work out a win-win situation. Then for tenants, if you have a mom-and-pop landlord, just know that if you're not able to make the rent, the landlord still has obligations that they have to pay, like their mortgage, property taxes, insurance. All of those continue whether or not rent is collected. That's why if you're not able to pay your rent, bring that up to the landlord and try to work out an amicable solution. Don't just not pay and then hope for the best. Separate from that, if you're dealing with a large management company who has lawyers on payroll, unfortunately, they're impossible to work with, and I don't have any advice. Just good luck on that. Besides that, though, in terms of this chart, even though the number going higher isn't great, a 1% increase from 2021 to 2025 really isn't that bad. And even in 2019, a 10% non-payment of rent was totally normal. So yes, I do think this is a bit blown out of proportion. I don't think it's anything to worry about, but it is something just to keep an eye on. And if you want me to keep you updated on this, please hit the like button and subscribe, because you bet I will keep you updated every step of the way. Thank you so much for watching. Also, don't forget to check out Cook Unity down below in the description. I absolutely love them. Highly recommend you try them out. Thank you again, and until next time.